I'm David Monroe. I'm 36 years old, and my parents chose to spend $350,000 on my brother's engagement party instead of paying $98,000 to save my dying son's life. Before I tell you how I ended up with everything and they ended up with nothing but a handwritten letter begging for my help, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. It all comes back to this letter. It arrived this morning, not in the mail but by a special courier. It looked ridiculously out of place on my desk, a single cream-colored envelope resting on a sea of architectural blueprints and signed contracts. My office is on the 40th floor of the Dominion Tower. From here, I can see most of downtown Denver, a landscape of glass and steel that I've had a hand in shaping. Just moments before the letter arrived, I was closing a call with Jonathan Reeves, the titan of real estate behind the new North Gate Tower. We were finalizing the interior concepts for the penthouse suites, a conversation involving seven-figure budgets and imported Italian marble. It's the world I live in now. As I hung up, my assistant, Mia, walked in. She's sharp, efficient, and fiercely protective of my time. She placed the envelope on my desk with a certain reverence. "This just came for you, David. The courier said it was personal and urgent," she said, her brow slightly furrowed with curiosity. "She knows my life, my schedule, my business partners. This letter fit nowhere." "Thanks, Mia," I said, my voice even. I picked it up. The cardstock was thick, expensive. Then I saw the handwriting. It was my mother's. I hadn't seen it in 5 years, but it was as familiar to me as my own reflection. That elegant, looping cursive, taught in the finest schools, designed to adorn invitations and thank you notes. But looking closely, I could see a faint tremor in the lines, a subtle shakiness that wasn't there before. For a long moment, I just sat there, holding it. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. There was only a profound and heavy stillness, the kind of calm you feel after a hurricane has passed and you're left standing in the wreckage. The storm was over. This was just an echo. With methodical slowness, I slid the silver letter opener, a gift from Jonathan Reeves when we closed the North Gate deal, under the flap and sliced it open. The letter inside was brief, just a few paragraphs. It was a masterclass in my mother's particular brand of communication. A cocktail of guilt, feigned regret, and subtle manipulation. It painted a bleak picture of their current reality. The business gone, my father's health failing, my brother Marcus adrift and penniless. It was all wrapped in the language of a victim, as if these were tragedies that had simply befallen them, like a bout of bad weather. The final sentence was a plea, a raw and desperate request for my help. I read it once. Then I read it again, dissecting the words. They were just words on a page. They had no power here. They couldn't reach the man I had become. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and opened the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. My past lives in that drawer. Tucked away behind old design sketches and a worn-out leather tape measure is a small silver frame. In it, a photo of my son, Noah, taken a year after his surgery. He's 9 years old, mid-laugh on a park swing, his head thrown back, eyes sparkling with a light I was terrified I'd never see again. Healthy, carefree, alive. I placed the letter from my mother beside the photo of my son, a ghost laid to rest next to a miracle. I closed the drawer, the quiet click sealing it in darkness. Turning my chair back to the window, my gaze went past the nearby buildings, fixing on the distant steel skeleton of a new skyscraper climbing into the sky. My project, my legacy. The letter was a relic from a life I had survived, a story that began long before my son's life was on the line. It was a story of a family where love was never given freely, only awarded to the winner. To truly understand the letter in that drawer, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It wasn't a home. It was a stage. My father, Stephen Monroe, was the proud owner of Monroe's Living, the most exclusive, high-end furniture store in Denver. He sold $1,000 chairs to people who had houses big enough to get lost in. My mother, Claudia, was the unspoken director of our lives. She orchestrated everything, From the brand of wine served at dinner parties to the carefully curated family photos posted on social media, their life's work was maintaining the illusion of perfection. But the problem with an illusion is that it isn't real. Behind the heavy oak doors, when the last guest's taillights had disappeared down our long driveway, the warmth vanished. The affection in our house was a finite resource, and it was allocated with brutal precision. It all flowed in one direction, to my younger brother, Marcus. I learned this lesson in 1,000 small ways, a series of paper cuts to the soul. I remember one evening in 8th grade with perfect clarity. I was a quiet kid, more comfortable with numbers than with people. Math made sense. It was logical. I studied for weeks for my final exams, driven by a desperate need to earn a simple good job from my father. I came home with my report card, my heart pounding. I'd done it. A perfect 100% in advanced algebra. I found my parents in the living room. My father was reading the Wall Street Journal, and my mother was flipping through a design magazine. "Hey, got my final grades," I announced, trying to sound casual. I handed the report card to my father. He glanced down at it, his eyes scanning the page before landing on the A+. He folded the paper and handed it back to me. "Good," he said, his attention already returning to his newspaper. "That's the standard we expect." My mother looked up from her magazine. "A+. That's nice, David. You did what you were supposed to do." And that was it. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement that I had not failed. I stood there for a moment, the report card feeling worthless in my hand, and then quietly went up to my room. A week later, Marcus came home, tossing his backpack on the floor. He'd passed his history class with a B+. That evening, it was an event. My father opened a bottle of sparkling cider he'd been saving. My mother baked a cake from scratch, decorating it with a triumphant "Way to go, Marcus" in blue icing. "A B+ in history," my father boomed, raising his glass. "That's fantastic, son. I knew you had it in you. Such a tough subject." Marcus beamed. "It was pretty hard," he said with a shrug, though I knew for a fact he'd crammed for the test the night before. I sat at the table, picking at a slice of cake I didn't want, watching them celebrate mediocrity as if it were genius. It was never about the achievement itself. It was about who achieved it. Marcus was effortless charm. I was diligent effort. In their eyes, only one of those was worth celebrating. The pattern was set in stone. I learned to be self-reliant. I got a job bagging groceries at 16 to save for a car, while Marcus was handed the keys to a brand new Jeep for his birthday. I poured all my energy into my schoolwork, my one escape. Architecture became my passion. I spent hours sketching, designing, creating worlds on paper that were orderly and beautiful. When I got my acceptance letter to a prestigious architecture program in Chicago, it was my ticket out. I told them during one of our formal family dinners. I laid the letter on the table. My father picked it up, read it, and set it down. "Chicago is a long way away," he said, a note of disapproval in his voice. "That's a tough field, David. Very competitive. Are you sure you're cut out for it?" "We'll see, I guess," I said. "Well," my mother added, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin, "just do your best. Don't embarrass the family name." 2 years later, Marcus, after barely graduating high school, decided to enroll in the local community college for a business degree. The announcement was met with elation. My parents threw him a massive going-away party. Even though he was just moving to an apartment 20 minutes away, the backyard was filled with my father's business associates and my mother's society friends. There was a string quartet. My father gave a speech about Marcus's boundless potential and his bright future in the world of business. He saw Marcus as his heir, the one who would take the Monroe name into the lucrative world of real estate development, a world my father had always wanted to conquer. I stood in the back, a drink in my hand, feeling like a complete stranger. So I left. I went to Chicago and never looked back. Those years were hard. I was lonely and broke, but I was also free. For the first time, my worth wasn't being measured against my brother's. It was measured by the quality of my work, by my own grit. I graduated with honors and returned to Denver, not to my family's world, but to build my own. I started a small design firm from nothing. It was during this time that I met Sarah. It felt like my life switched from black and white to color. I was surveying a small model apartment for a contractor. She was the electrical engineer, her brow furrowed in concentration as she mapped out the wiring for a smart lighting system. We started talking about lumens and ambient light, and the conversation drifted to how a space could make you feel, how a home could be a sanctuary. We talked for 2 hours and it felt like 2 minutes. She saw me. Not the son of Stephen Monroe, not the brother of Marcus, just David. We married a year later. It was a perfect day. We held the ceremony in Washington Park, with about 30 of our closest friends. We grilled hot dogs and drank cheap beer. My parents came, of course. They had to make an appearance. My mother wore a Chanel suit that probably cost more than our entire wedding, and my father spent the whole time checking his watch. They stayed for an hour. Sarah's parents, Carol and Henry, were there from dawn till dusk. They helped us set up the tables, they flipped burgers, they danced with my friends. They were warm, genuine, and kind. As my parents were leaving, I overheard my mother say to one of her friends, her voice dripping with condescension, "It's all very frugal, quaint, but David was always the practical one." I didn't let it ruin my day. I had Sarah. I had her wonderful parents. I had a family that felt real. Soon after, Noah was born, and my world cracked wide open with a love I had never known. He had Sarah's bright smile and my intense, curious eyes. Our life was a beautiful, chaotic struggle. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and my office was a corner of our living room. Every penny I earned went right back into our life: rent, groceries, diapers. My business was growing, but it was slow and steady. There was never much left over at the end of the month. That's why I kept putting off the health insurance. It was a line item on our budget that always seemed astronomical. A few $100s a month that could go towards so many other, more immediate things. We were all young and healthy. "Next month," I'd tell Sarah, "after I land that coffee shop contract, we'll sign up for the premium plan." It was a practical decision made by a man who had been taught to be practical. A gamble. And I was about to find out that I had bet my son's life and lost. The storm didn't arrive with a bang. Crept in, disguised as a common cold. Noah was 8. A whirlwind of a boy who lived in a universe of superheroes and Lego creations. When he started coughing in the middle of a crisp Denver autumn, we didn't think much of it. We loaded him up with juice and chicken soup. But the cough didn't leave. It settled deep in his chest, a dry, persistent hack that started to steal his energy. Night, it was worse. We would lie in bed, listening to the sound of our son struggling for breath in the next room. We took him to the clinic. The doctor listened to his lungs, prescribed an inhaler for what she called a nasty case of bronchitis, and sent us home. But I couldn't shake the image of her face as she listened to his chest, that brief, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. A couple of weeks later, the boy who used to run everywhere was walking. The boy who could talk for hours was quiet. One afternoon, he was sitting on the living room floor, his coloring book open but untouched. He looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that sent a spear of ice through my heart. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice raspy. "My heart is doing a funny dance." I knelt beside him and pressed my hand to his small chest. His heart was fluttering, a rapid, panicked rhythm against my palm. His skin was cool and clammy. Time seemed to slow down. The casual hum of the refrigerator, the sound of traffic outside. It all faded into a roaring in my ears. This was wrong. This was terrifyingly wrong. Sarah drove. I don't remember the drive to the city hospital, only the feeling of Noah's small, trembling body in my arms in the back seat. I kept whispering that everything was going to be okay, a desperate litany against the rising tide of panic. The emergency room was a surreal nightmare of bright lights, beeping machines, and the calm, terrifying efficiency of the medical staff. They whisked Noah away, and Sarah and I were left in a small, sterile waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. For hours we sat in silence, holding hands, each lost in our own private hell of what-ifs. Finally, a doctor named Michael Chun entered the room. He wasn't smiling. He held a thick file in his hands, and his expression was one of gentle, professional gravity. He sat down opposite us. "We found something on the CT scan," he began, his voice even. "There's a mass in Noah's left lung. A tumor." The word hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. "Tumor. We believe it's benign," he continued quickly, seeing the terror on our faces. "But its location is the problem. It's growing in a way that is compressing his main airway. That's why he's struggling to breathe. It's also beginning to put pressure on his heart. If we don't remove it, and soon, it could lead to catastrophic failure." My mind couldn't process the words. It was like listening to a language I didn't understand. Sarah found her voice first. "So, surgery?" "Yes," Dr. Chun said. "Immediately. We need to schedule it for as soon as possible, within the next 3 days at the latest." He paused, and his eyes softened with a look of practiced empathy. "I know this is a lot to take in. We also need to discuss the financial aspect. The procedure, along with the necessary post-operative care and hospital stay, will cost approximately $98,000. The number didn't even seem real. $98,000. It was an impossible sum, a mountain we could never hope to climb. We had about $15,000 in our savings account. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to swallow hard to keep from being sick. All those months of putting off the insurance, all my practicality, it had all led to this. I had failed him. But Sarah, my incredible, resilient Sarah, looked the doctor square in the eye. Her voice didn't waver. "We will get the money. Schedule the surgery." The moment Dr. Chun left the room, her strength dissolved, and she collapsed against me, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. I held on to her, my own fear a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. That night was the longest of my life. I tried everything. I called our bank. The loan officer was polite but firm. Our debt-to-income ratio was too high. Denied. I launched a GoFundMe page, my fingers fumbling as I tried to write a compelling plea without sounding like a failure. Donations trickled in, $20 here, $50 there, from kind friends, but it was a thimble of water against a forest fire. As I sat by Noah's bedside, watching the monitor trace the frantic, irregular rhythm of his heart, I finally broke. I couldn't watch my son suffocate while my pride kept me from making one last, desperate call. I stepped out into the hallway and dialed my mother's number. She answered with her usual smooth, unruffled tone. "David, it's nearly midnight. Is everything all right?" The words tumbled out of me, a torrent of fear and desperation. "Mom, it's Noah. He's in the hospital. He has a tumor. He needs emergency surgery. Mom, they said it's critical. We don't have the money. The insurance, it wasn't enough. We need help. A loan. Please. I'll pay back every single cent, I swear." There was a beat of silence. Not a compassionate silence, but a cold, calculating one. Then she spoke, her voice laced with an icy annoyance. "Oh, David, this is just the most dreadful timing. Your father's 40th anniversary party is next week. The planning has been going on for months. The caterers are booked. The invitations have been sent. So many important people will be there. It would be an absolute nightmare to try and rearrange things now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Party? Mom, I'm not asking you to cancel a party. I'm talking about your grandson's life. And I am talking about our reputation," she retorted, her voice hardening, "which you seem intent on damaging. Honestly, David, you are a grown man. You should have had proper insurance. This is a consequence of your poor planning, and it is not our responsibility to fix it. Poor planning, I whispered, my throat closing up. He's 8 years old. He's your grandson. Don't take that tone with me, she said sharply. I am very sorry to hear about Noah, but our hands are tied. We have obligations. We simply can't help. Click. She hung up. I slid down the wall, the phone clattering to the floor. It wasn't just a no. It was a judgment. My son's life had been weighed against the inconvenience of rescheduling a party, and the party had won. The next day, I drove to their mansion. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just had to make them see him, see the pictures, the scans. If they saw, they would understand. When I arrived, the driveway was already lined with luxury cars. It was a pre-engagement luncheon for Marcus and his fiancée, Natalie, the daughter of a real estate tycoon. It was a strategic alliance, a merger of two powerful families. I walked through the front door and into a scene of clinking champagne glasses and forced laughter. I found my mother, resplendent in a silk dress, holding court, pulled her aside. Mom, please, just look at these, I said, my hands shaking as I held out Noah's medical file. She recoiled as if I were holding something dirty. David, you are making a scene. Put that away. You are embarrassing us. My father appeared, his face a mask of thunderous rage. What is the meaning of this? You dare to bring your troubles to our doorstep, today of all days. He's your grandson, I pleaded, my voice cracking. He needs $98,000 to live. Then, Marcus sauntered over, a smug, contemptuous smirk on his face. He sipped his champagne. Wow, bro, seriously? You screw up and you expect the whole family to grind to a halt? This party, this engagement, this is my future. It's a little more important than your cash flow problem. Don't be so selfish. That's when my father delivered the killing blow. He looked me up and down, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. That's the price of failure, David, he said, his voice void of all emotion. You chose to walk your own path against my advice. Now you deal with the consequences. Do not interfere with your brother's future. I looked from my father's merciless face to my mother's icy stare to my brother's cruel smirk. They weren't family. They were strangers. Strangers who would rather toast to a business deal than save a child's life. I turned and walked away. Every step out of that house felt like I was walking on broken glass. I got in my car, and the dam finally broke. But the tears that streamed down my face weren't tears of grief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. And in that moment I made a vow. I would save my son. And then I would build a life so successful, so powerful, that one day they would have to look up at me from the ruins of their own shallow world. Returning to the hospital felt like returning to a different planet. The world of champagne and cold-hearted ambition was gone, replaced by the quiet beeps of machines and the sterile smell of reality. I walked into Noah's room, my heart a block of ice in my chest. Sarah took one look at my face and knew. She didn't need me to say a word. She simply came to me, wrapped her arms around my waist, and held me. Okay, she whispered into my shoulder, her voice fierce and steady. It's just us, then. So let's get to work. Those next 3 days were a frantic, desperate scramble against time. We became a two-person fundraising machine, fueled by caffeine and sheer terror. The first thing to go was Sarah's truck. It was a beautiful old Ford she'd had since before I met her. It had dents and scratches, each one with a story. She loved that truck. She posted it on Craigslist that night, and it sold the next morning for $6,000. She handed the cash to me with a grim smile, not a single tear in her eye. I went through our apartment like a whirlwind, seeing everything not as a possession but as a price tag. The comfortable couch we'd bought together for our first apartment, the one where we'd binge-watched shows and rocked Noah to sleep, I sold it for $300 to a group of college kids. My drafting table, my primary tool of the trade, went for $500. Our television, our bookshelves, my old collection of vinyl records. Everything. Strangers paraded through our home, picking over the artifacts of our life, haggling over $20 here, $10 there. A kind-faced woman who bought our dining room set asked, "Are you two moving somewhere exciting?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, her voice impossibly cheerful. A new beginning. Amidst the humiliation and the fear, there were pinpricks of light. Small acts of breathtaking kindness that kept us from completely falling apart. Anna, my best friend from architecture school, called me. She was a single mom who taught music part-time. I knew she barely scraped by. "David, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could do more. I'm transferring you everything I've got in my savings." A few minutes later, a notification popped up on my phone. A Zelle payment for $500. I knew that money was probably her rent, her safety net. I cried right there in the hospital cafeteria. Then there was Travis. He was a junior designer at my small firm, a kid just a couple of years out of school, full of talent and ambition. He showed up at the hospital during his lunch break, looking awkward and shy. He handed me a crumpled white envelope. "It's not much," he stammered, avoiding my gaze. "I was saving up for a new laptop. It's $320. I think Noah needs it more." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "We're all rooting for him at the office." I was so choked up I couldn't form words. I just pulled him into a hug, this kind young man who owed me nothing. We raised nearly $30,000 that way. A patchwork of generosity from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who saw Sarah's desperate posts on social media. It was a miracle, but it was also $68,000 short of what we needed. The deadline was the next day. I started seriously researching high-interest, predatory loans online, the kind that cripple you for life. I felt the walls closing in, the air getting thin. That night, while I was frantically filling out a loan application on my phone, a long-shot memory surfaced. In the blur of my late-night research, I'd read an article about a developer named Jonathan Reeves, a maverick known for his focus on building healing spaces and community-centric projects. His philosophy had resonated with me. On a desperate, sleepless whim, I had found his company's website and sent an email to the general contact address. It was a Hail Mary pass. I didn't ask for money. I just wrote from the heart about my own design philosophy, how I believed good design could be a form of care, and attached my small portfolio. I never expected to hear back. The evening before the surgery was scheduled, our absolute final deadline, Sarah's parents, Carol and Henry, came to the hospital. They looked tired, their faces etched with the same worry that lined our own. They brought a thermos of coffee and sat with us, their quiet presence a small comfort. I expected more words of encouragement, maybe a check for a few $100s that I knew they couldn't afford. After a few minutes of quiet conversation, Henry cleared his throat. He looked at me, then at Sarah. "Kids," he began, his voice raspy. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He slid it across the small table. "We need you to look at this." I unfolded it. It was a real estate contract, purchase and sale agreement, for their house. My eyes scanned the page, but my brain refused to comprehend the words until I saw the sale price at the bottom. $136,000. And the closing date, today. I looked up at him, stunned. I don't understand. What is this?" Carol reached across the table and took my hand. Her hand was warm, her grip firm. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "It's just a house, David," she said softly. "It's just bricks and wood. We raised our daughter there, we have our memories. That's all that matters. We can rent an apartment. We'll be fine." Henry leaned forward, his expression earnest and fierce. "Noah only gets one life. You are our children. This is what family does. No discussion." I stared at them, at these two quiet, unassuming heroes. They had taken their life's biggest asset, their sanctuary, the repository of 30 years of memories, and they had liquidated it without a second thought to save my son. They had done what my own wealthy, powerful parents, with their mansions and their luxury cars, had refused to do. The dam of my carefully controlled emotions broke. I dropped my head into my hands and wept, not the hot tears of rage I'd shed in my car, but tears of a gratitude so profound it was physically painful. In the sterile, impersonal quiet of that hospital waiting room, I was witnessing the most beautiful, selfless act of love I had ever seen. The next morning, the wire transfer went through. We had the money. The surgery was on. For 6 hours that felt like 6 years, we waited. Finally, the door to the waiting room opened. It was Dr. Chun, his surgical mask hanging around his neck. He looked tired, but he was smiling a real, genuine smile. "He's a trooper," the doctor said, his voice filled with warmth. "The surgery was a complete success. We got the entire tumor. The prognosis is excellent. He's going to be fine." Sarah and I clung to each other, our knees weak with relief. Over her shoulder, I saw Carol and Henry, holding each other and crying silently. We had made it through the storm. Our boy was safe. And as I looked at the faces of my real family, I made a new vow, a silent one. I would spend the rest of my days making sure their sacrifice was honored, and that the people who had turned their backs on us would one day understand the true meaning of the word consequence. The 5 years that followed Noah's recovery were a study in transformation. The white-hot rage I felt toward my parents and brother didn't fade away. I learned how to use it. It became the coal that fueled my engine. It became the discipline that got me out of bed at 4:30 every morning. Every time I felt the exhaustion creeping in, every time a project felt too overwhelming, I would close my eyes. I'd see my father's dismissive wave, my mother's cold stare, my brother's cruel smirk. Then, I'd see the image of Carol and Henry packing their cherished belongings into cardboard boxes. The contrast was all the motivation I ever needed. My work became my sanctuary and my weapon. I rebranded my small company to Monroe Studio, a deliberate act of reclaiming my own name. I was no longer just a designer. I was a man on a mission. The first couple of years were a brutal, humbling grind. Noah's health was our priority, and his recovery involved a seemingly endless series of follow-up appointments and checkups. In between, I took any and every job I could land. I designed kitchens for suburban families. I chose color palettes for dental offices. I staged cramped condos for real estate agents. No job was too small. I was on construction sites by sunrise, meeting with clients all afternoon, and then I'd go home to our small rental apartment, have dinner with Sarah and Noah, and work until 2 a.m. at our kitchen table, sketching and refining designs. It wasn't a straight line to the top. I faced plenty of setbacks. I remember one project in particular, a small boutique hotel. I poured weeks into the proposal, crafting a concept I was incredibly proud of. I made it to the final round, only to get a polite email saying they had decided to go with a more established firm. The rejection was a gut punch. Cost me time and money I didn't have. For a moment, sitting in my cramped office, I felt that old voice of my father whispering in my ear, "Price of failure." But then I looked at a picture of Noah on my desk, and the fire came roaring back. I just worked harder. My reputation started to grow, not through flashy marketing, but through word of mouth. Clients praised my attention to detail, my integrity, and my ability to create spaces that felt deeply personal. The turning point came in the 3rd year in the most unexpected way. I was working late one night when an email popped into my inbox. The subject line was simple, "Your design philosophy." My heart skipped a beat. I opened it. It was from Jonathan Reeves, the developer, the man I had sent that desperate Hail Mary email to 2 years before. He wrote that my message had somehow found its way to his desk, passed up the chain from a junior assistant. He said he received hundreds of proposals a week, but mine had stood out. He was intrigued by my passion and my persistence in following up, even though I'd gotten no reply. He was launching a new flagship coffee shop in a trendy neighborhood and was tired of the same old corporate designs. He wanted to know if I was interested in submitting a proposal. This was my shot. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I didn't just design a coffee shop. I designed an experience. I envisioned a community living room, with warm woods, comfortable nooks, and local art. A healing space, just as he'd described in that article. Reeves didn't just like it, he loved it. He said it was the most soulful proposal he'd seen in years. The coffee shop, the daily ritual, became a massive runaway success. It was featured in local magazines and design blogs. Suddenly, Monroe Studio wasn't just another small firm. We had a hit. That single project was the key that unlocked everything. The success of the coffee shop led to a contract to design a boutique spa for one of Reeves's associates. The spa won a prestigious regional design award. And that award led to the phone call that changed my life forever. It was Jonathan Reeves again. He was brief and to the point. "David," he said, his voice booming with energy. "I'm breaking ground on my biggest project yet. An entire residential complex in the North End. I want your vision. I want Monroe Studio as the lead interior designer for the entire development." It was the kind of contract that builds legacies. By the 5th anniversary of Noah's surgery, the world was a different place. Monroe Studio was a force to be reckoned with. We had a stunning, full-floor office in the Dominion Tower, a team of a dozen brilliant, hungry young designers, and a waiting list of high-profile clients. I had built a fortress of success around my family, a wall so high and so strong I thought no ghost from the past could ever penetrate it. I finally felt like I could breathe, but I always knew they were out there watching, and I had a sense that our story wasn't over. A final reckoning was coming. I just never could have predicted the form it would take. The first tremor came on a Tuesday morning. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I hadn't seen in 5 years. My mother. I stared at it until the buzzing stopped, a cold, familiar dread coiling in my gut. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was brief, her voice tight with a forced, unnatural warmth. "David, darling, it's your mother. Please call me back. It's very important. It's about the family." I deleted it. An hour later, my direct office line rang. Mia, my assistant, patched it through to my desk. "David, I have a Marcus Monroe on the line for you. He says it's a family emergency." "I'm in a meeting all day, Mia," I said, my voice flat. "Take a message." The message Marcus left was a frantic, rambling mess about needing to talk, about how things had gotten bad. I deleted that too. The final attempt was the one that got through. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a formal email sent to my company's general inquiry address, a clear sign of their desperation. The sender was Stephen Monroe, CEO of Monroe's Living. The subject line read, "Urgent Partnership Proposal, Monroe and Monroe." I already knew what it was about. In the tight-knit world of Denver's business community, secrets don't stay secret for long. The whispers had been growing for months. Monroe's Living was dying. A series of disastrously risky real estate investments, coupled with my father's arrogant refusal to adapt to a changing market, had bled the company dry. They were on the brink of bankruptcy. Their last, desperate gambit was a project they'd named the Monroe Legacy Towers, a massive luxury complex they hoped would be their salvation. They owned the land, but the banks wouldn't give them another dime. Their only hope was to secure funding from a powerful international investment group. And here's where the universe delivered its punchline. The deal was being brokered by Natalie, my brother's ex-fiancée, whose family's firm specialized in such ventures. And after months of negotiations, the investors had laid down one final, non-negotiable condition. They were impressed by the recent architectural buzz in Denver. They would only fund the project if the interiors, the key selling point for a luxury brand, were designed and executed by the firm that had become synonymous with quality, integrity, and meteoric success. My firm, Monroe Studio, my name, the one they had dismissed and devalued, was now the only thing that could save theirs. I replied to the email with a single line, "My boardroom, Thursday, 10 a.m. I made them come to me. I watched on my office security monitor as they walked into the reception area. My father, Stephen, and my brother, Marcus. They looked like ghosts. Their expensive suits hung on them differently now, no longer projecting power, but trying to conceal defeat. They were swallowed by the high ceilings and clean lines of the world I had built. They looked small. I let them wait for exactly 10 minutes before having Mia show them into the main boardroom. The room is my favorite in the entire office. It's walled with glass on two sides, offering a panoramic view of the city. A long, imposing table of reclaimed oak sits in the center. I was already seated at the head of it when they walked in. They took the seats opposite me. The silence was thick and heavy. My father, ever the performer, tried to seize control. He launched into a polished, almost rehearsed speech about the importance of family, about letting bygones be bygones. He spoke of legacy, of the Monroe name, of a shared future. It was a decent performance, but his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading terror. Marcus just sat there, staring at the table, his usual smugness replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. He looked like a child who'd been dragged to a meeting he didn't understand. I let my father's speech hang in the air for a long moment after he finished. Then, I picked up the small remote beside me and turned on the 80-inch screen that dominated the far wall. Before we talk about a shared future, I said, my voice perfectly level, I think it's crucial we have a clear understanding of our shared past. The first image flashed onto the screen. It was a high-resolution scan of a document, a hospital invoice from 5 years ago. My son's name was at the top, and at the bottom, a single, damning number was circled in bright red, $98,000. I heard a sharp, choked gasp from Marcus. My father's face went white as a sheet. This, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, was the cost of my son's life. A number you both told me was not your problem. I clicked the remote again. A new slide appeared. It was a scanned page from a glossy society magazine, a full-color photo from Marcus's lavish engagement party. There they were, my father, my mother, my brother, their faces flush with happiness, raising glasses of champagne. Below the photo was the text of the article, gushing about the extravagant event. I'd had a private investigator dig up the actual invoices from the caterers, the florist, the band. The final, verified total was displayed on the screen in massive, unforgiving numbers, $350,000. And this, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, is what you decided was more important. The room was utterly still. My father looked as if he'd been physically struck. I stood up slowly, my chair gliding back silently on the polished concrete floor. I walked to the head of the table, placing my hands flat on the cool oak. You come into my office, into the company I built from nothing, and you have the audacity to speak to me of legacy? I looked from my father's ashen face to my brother's stunned, slack-jawed expression. Let me tell you about legacy. My legacy. Monroe Studio is built on a foundation of trust, of integrity, of creating spaces that bring people comfort and security and healing. That is the work we do here. That is what my name now represents. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto my father's. Your foundation, I said, and each word was a hammer blow, is built on selfishness. It's built on cruelty. It's built on a conscious decision to value a party over a child's life. Your own grandchild. I straightened up. I cannot and I will not attach my name, the name I have redeemed, to a foundation that is so utterly rotten to its core. I looked at my father. There is no partnership. I looked at my brother. There is no deal. My voice was quiet, but it echoed in the tomb-like silence of the room. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them there alone with their ghosts on the screen. The collapse was not a slow crumble. It was an implosion. The day after the boardroom meeting, I got a brief, professional email from Jonathan Reeves. It was a link to a press release from the International Investment Group. The statement was brutal in its corporate politeness. It announced the immediate and permanent termination of their interest in the Monroe Legacy Towers project, citing a fundamental misalignment of brand values and a lack of confidence in the project's leadership. Later that day, I got a call from an old acquaintance who ran in Natalie's social circle. The gossip was already flying. Natalie herself had delivered the news to the investors after my meeting. She then called Marcus. It wasn't an emotional breakup. It was a corporate execution. "Marcus," she had said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "My family's name is its most valuable asset. We cannot afford to have it associated with the kind of personal and financial liability your family represents. The engagement is off. The business relationship is terminated. Do not contact me again." It was the ultimate irony. She had abandoned him for the very same reason they had abandoned me. It was a bad look. It threatened the illusion. Without the investors, the last pillar holding up my father's crumbling empire gave way. 2 weeks later, the headline flashed across the bottom of a 24-hour business news channel I had on in my office. "Monroe's living files for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, ceasing all operations." I watched the words scroll by, and I felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even a shred of pity. I just felt a quiet finality. A long, painful chapter of my life had finally, definitively, ended. My focus shifted completely. The past was settled. Now it was time to build the future, and to honor the people who had made it possible. My success felt hollow unless it was shared with those who had propped me up when I was at my lowest. The first person I called was Anna, my friend from college. She came to my office, looking just the same as she always had. Kind eyes, a warm smile, wearing a comfortable, slightly frayed cardigan. We talked for a while about our kids, about life. Then I slid an envelope across the desk. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Open it," I said gently. She pulled out a cashier's check made out to her name. For $50,000. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "David, no, I can't. I couldn't possibly." "Anna," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "5 years ago, you gave me $500 that I know you couldn't afford. You gave me everything you had. You never asked for it back. You never even mentioned it. Do you have any idea what that meant to me? What it meant to Sarah?" I leaned forward. "This isn't a loan. So thank you. Go open that music school for underprivileged kids you've always talked about. Go change some lives." She broke down in tears, and we just sat there for a minute, two old friends, one of us finally able to repay an unpayable debt. My next visit was to Travis. The brilliant young designer was no longer a kid. He was a cornerstone of my firm. I called him into my office. "Travis," I began. "Do you remember? 5 years ago, you came to the hospital and gave me an envelope with $320 in it?" He flushed, looking down at his shoes. "Yeah, of course. You said it was your laptop money. Did you ever get that new laptop?" He grinned. "Eventually." "Good," I said, sliding a thick brochure across the desk. It was for the top-ranked graduate program in architecture at my alma mater in Chicago. "Because you're going to need a good one. You're enrolled for the fall semester. Full scholarship plus a living stipend. All covered by the company. You have a gift, Travis. I want you to go sharpen it into something legendary." The stunned joy on his face was a reward in itself. But the biggest debt remained. The one I could never truly repay. Carol and Henry, my real parents. They were happy. They loved their little rental apartment, and more than anything, they loved having us and a healthy Noah just a few minutes away. But I saw the way Carol would sometimes look at a photograph of her old rose garden. I heard the wistful note in Henry's voice when he talked about the workshop he used to have in their garage. I had hired a private investigator a few months earlier, just to keep an eye on their old house. As fate would have it, the family who had bought it was being transferred for a job out of state. They were getting ready to list it. I had my investigator approach them with an offer they couldn't refuse. 30% above the highest market appraisal. All cash, close in 10 days. It was a done deal before the "for sale" sign ever touched the lawn. For the next 2 months, Monroe Studio undertook its most important project. It was a secret operation. My team, sworn to silence, worked tirelessly. We didn't want to change the house they loved, we wanted to restore it. We put in a beautiful, modern kitchen for Carol, with a big farmhouse sink and a professional-grade stove. We rebuilt the garage into a dream workshop for Henry, with custom cabinetry and perfect lighting. We redesigned the back porch, turning it into a beautiful sunroom overlooking the rose garden, which we had professionally replanted. On Carol's birthday, I told them I was taking them out for a fancy dinner. I drove, and as I turned onto their old, familiar street, Carol looked at me, confused. "David, honey, the restaurant is the other way." "I know," I said, smiling. "We're making a quick stop first." I pulled into the driveway of their old house. The porch light was on. The rose bushes were in full bloom. I turned off the engine and looked at them. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and dawning, tearful realization. I took a set of keys from my pocket. Attached was a small, custom-made silver tag. It was engraved with one word, home. I placed the keys in Carol's trembling hand. "Welcome home, Mom. Welcome home, Dad," I whispered. That night, we didn't go to a fancy restaurant. We sat on the floor of our living room, eating pizza out of the box, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 happy memories and the promise of 1,000 more. And in the warmth and light of that house, a home bought not with money, but with love, I felt a peace I had never known. And so we come back to this morning, to the letter. After my family had gone home last night, after the echoes of our laughter had faded, I sat alone in my office for a long time. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of infinite stories. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and took out the cream-colored envelope. The elegant handwriting seemed to mock me from a life I no longer recognized. I carried it from my office, walking through the quiet, darkened studio where so many dreams were being sketched into reality. I went to my private study at the back, a room I designed for quiet reflection. It has a fireplace, built from fieldstone and reclaimed timber. I stood before the empty hearth for a long time, the letter feeling weightless in my hand. I reread the words one last time. My mother's words. They spoke of regret, but what I read was regret for their consequences, not for their actions. They spoke of hardship, but it was a hardship they had authored themselves. It was a plea for a lifeline from the people who had refused to offer one to a drowning child. A part of me, a small, old part, was tempted to write back, to draft a cold, precise letter detailing every one of their sins, to explain, in excruciating detail, how their single, selfish choice had been the catalyst for their own destruction. I could have laid their failure at their feet, and I would have been justified in doing so. But as I stood there, looking at the neatly folded paper, I felt no anger. I felt no burning need for that final, verbal revenge. The rage had burned out long ago, leaving behind something clean and quiet. They were no longer the monstrous villains of my story. They weren't heroes. They weren't anything. Their opinions, their approval, their very existence had ceased to be a factor in the equation of my life. The power they once held over me was gone. With a steady hand, I knelt down. I crumpled the letter into a ball, the expensive paper crackling in protest. I placed it in the center of the hearth on the cold stone. I took a long match, struck it, and touched the flame to the edge of the paper. Caught fire instantly. I watched the elegant cursive blacken and curl into illegibility. I watched the paper that had carried so much pain and manipulation turn into a fragile, gray ash. It was the last ghost, the last toxic artifact from a life I had survived. As the last ember died, a profound sense of peace settled over me, deeper and more complete than any I had ever known. I was free. I stood up and walked back to the window. The first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day. I thought about Sarah and Noah, likely still asleep at home. I thought about Carol and Henry, waking up in their own beds, in their own home. My father had been wrong all those years ago. He had spoken of the price of failure. But I hadn't failed. I had simply chosen to build a different kind of legacy, one not measured by the height of our buildings, but by the strength of our foundation. And I learned that a family isn't the blood you share. It's the people who are willing to bleed for you. It's the people who show up in the storm. and my storm was finally truly over. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it touched you in some way. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose your own path, even if it meant leaving people behind? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all. And if this resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.